This is lecture number DR055AA11. It is the 55th lecture of the Mega Genius Lectures and the 11th lecture of the Advanced Abilities series. It was recorded on September 2nd, 2016. The title of this lecture is The Abyss and a Brutal Affair from the Great Mystery of Jack the Ripper, Parts 1 and 2. It is 29 minutes long, copyright 2005 and 2016 by Mega Genius Incorporated, all rights reserved. This lecture is protected by internationally valid copyright. It may not in whole or in part be duplicated, transmitted, or otherwise reproduced without the express permission of Mega Genius Incorporated. Unauthorized translation, importation, or distribution is a violation of applicable laws. Mega Genius is a United States federally registered trademark and service mark. And now, here's Mega Genius.
It is as thrilling as a treasure hunt to scrutinize a mystery and discover the truth, whatever it is. Nothing is as captivating as a great mystery or as intriguing as one being investigated. If you do not agree, then you have too many mysteries in your life and not enough truth. Imagine Victorian London in the autumn of 1888, in the dead of a moonless night. Fog swirls about the streets and narrow alleys, momentarily revealing and then again enveloping gaslights. Only the wheels of a covered carriage clattering over cobblestones in the distance breaks the midnight silence. Suddenly a faceless figure, shrouded in black and armed with a long razor-sharp knife, strides into a shadowed, narrow passageway. Behind him, in the darkest corner of a courtyard, lies the brutally butchered body of still another victim of Jack the Ripper, the world's most famous serial killer. This is the classic whodunit. There are several reasons why the legend of Jack the Ripper is the world's most famous murder mystery. First, the newspapers of his day sensationalized him across Europe and the Atlantic. No other serial killer had ever received such wide-ranging publicity. Second, he did not merely stab his victims to death. He mercilessly slaughtered them as a farmer might gut a barnyard animal. Third, he disposed of them incredibly quickly, often executing and then butchering them within just a few minutes, leaving their still warm bodies to be discovered before their flowing blood could even clot. Fourth, with blood-drenched hands and stained clothing, he abruptly vanished, time after time, as one observer noted, as if, quote, through a trap door in the earth, unquote. Fifth, he removed and apparently ate internal organs of his victims. Sixth, he had no obvious motive. Seventh, even though the authorities knew how and to a significant degree whom, when, and where he would kill, he continuously baffled both the London City Police and Scotland Yard. Now, any mystery contains one or more lies. Over time, one of two things occurs with any mystery. Either sufficient truth comes to light for the lies to be seen and for the mystery to be solved, or enough new lies are introduced to cause the mystery to deepen and darken and persist. The fact that Jack the Ripper has become the world's most famous murder mystery tells us that there have been too many assumptions that things that happened did not, or that things that did not happen did, or both. Some of the lies of this mystery exist because a profusion of false information has been disseminated for well over a century. It began with unverified stories by reporters at the time of the Ripper's murders, intended only to sell more newspapers, and continues throughout the world today in the form of erroneous books, plays, films, and television documentaries. Other lies about the Ripper exist because some information about the crimes has been lost. Obfuscating the truth further, insignificant details have been stressed by many authors, while important facts have been ignored. In the process, dozens of investigators have purported to have finally discovered the identity of Jack the Ripper, which they have offered to the public in books alleging that the case has been closed, and the final chapter written, and the final solution revealed, and the mystery solved, and the bloody truth exposed. Yet all have fallen prey to their own glaring inaccuracies, while the mystery of Jack the Ripper endures and increasingly confounds. Regardless of what you may have heard, the Ripper did not wear a formal top hat and cape and carry a Gladstone bag. Aside from the fact that he murdered people with a knife in Victorian London, probably everything else that you know about who he was and what he did is false. Those are the lies that envelop the mystery. The Ripper murdered so viciously that few people have ever been willing to confront the horrific details, which has only added to the mystery and its endurance. Let's intelligently review some of the verifiable evidence that has survived from the late 1800s into the 21st century. Some of it may be difficult to face, but it is an axiom of life that anyone who lacks the courage to look also lacks the ability to understand. Actually, the Ripper slayings were not centered in London, but in what is known as the East End, in a district just northeast of the city called Whitechapel. That is where you can still find the Whitechapel Bell Foundry, Britain's oldest manufacturing company. It was founded in 1420, during the reign of Henry V, a lifetime before Columbus sailed to America. It was at that foundry that America's original 2,000-pound Liberty Bell was manufactured in 1752, and the 27,000-pound Big Ben in 1858 for the clock in the Palace of Westminster. North of the Whitechapel Bell Foundry is Old Spitalfields Market, established by Charles II in 1682. There the merchants used to hang up second-hand clothes on hooks above the market stalls, and customers asked that items be handed down so that they could get a closer look, hence the expression hand-me-downs. The market is barely outside of London, only a few blocks east of a street known as Houndsditch, where a large trench once ran just outside the Roman wall, marking London's perimeter, into which garbage was continually thrown, including dead hounds. In 1888, Whitechapel was a maze of filthy streets and alleys and courts. Its name was synonymous with overcrowding, with poverty and squalor and unsanitary conditions. Although murders were infrequent in Spitalfields, other crimes were common, yet the residents of the mire were not to be feared as much as pitied for their unfortunate lot. The worst area was in Spitalfields, across the street from Old Spitalfields Market, near the 10 Bells Pub, which was established in 1852. Next door was Itchy Park, a churchyard described years later by Jack London in his book The People of the Abyss. In it, the author studied the residents there near the beginning of the 20th century, each of whom seemed to fear what Jack London called the thing, which was the illness or injury or other personal catastrophes that would push the person over the edge into the abyss from which there was no escape. For some, that thing was Jack the Ripper, for it was there, near the 10 Bells, that he stalked and disemboweled his ill-fated victims. Now, when the massacre began, it was known at first as the Whitechapel Murders. Later, when it soon became apparent that a single mastermind was responsible, the slayings were attributed to Jack the Ripper. The Ripper, however, did not commit all the murders, just most of them, all within a radius of less than 1/2 mile. In all probability, his victims totaled 6. Because of his swiftness, invisibility, and brutality, he drove the residents of Whitechapel to the highest pitch of terror. In the early morning darkness of the 7th of August, 1888, Jack the Ripper struck his first victim, Martha Tabram. She had been born in the London borough of Southwark 39 years before. When she was 16, her father had unexpectedly died. Then at age 20, she had married Henry Samuel Tabram, a foreman furniture packer with whom she had 2 sons. Just a few years later, Henry left her due to her alcoholism, but continued to provide her with financial support. 3 years later, she moved in with Henry Turner, a carpenter who was also troubled by her drinking. He said, if I gave her any money, she generally spent it in drink. In fact, it was always drink. Throughout the next 12 years, they occasionally separated briefly. Then Turner lost his job, and they both walked the streets, hawking needles, pins, and keychains. Finally, they fell behind in their rent, and he left her again, at which point she became destitute and finally resorted to prostitution. The going rate in Whitechapel at that time was 3 pence. Turner, though, continued to give her what little money he could for small trinkets in the hope that she could eke out a meager but decent living. Another prostitute, known on the streets as Pearly Paul, had seen Martha and a soldier walking up a narrow alley in Spitalfields called George Yard toward George Yard Buildings just before midnight. George Yard Buildings was a block of the most squalid dwellings. After she had completed her transaction with that John, just about 4 blocks from the 10 Bells, no one seems to have seen Martha Tabram alive during the next 3 hours, except Jack the Ripper. At about 1:40 a.m., a young couple arrived home at George Yard Buildings. In the darkness, they climbed the stone stairs to the landing and entered their lodging. Moments later, the wife descended the stairs again, quickly bought some provisions at a nearby store, and then returned, climbing the stairs again at about 1:50 a.m. Neither she nor her husband had noticed anything unusual. At 3:30 a.m., George Crow, a cab driver, returned home to George Yard Buildings and noticed someone lying in the darkness on the landing. Thinking that the person was sleeping, though, he took no further notice. Then at about 4:45 a.m., as the dawn was breaking, another resident, John Saunders, discovered the body of Martha Tabram lying on the landing, on her back, in a pool of blood, with her clothes turned up as far as the center of her body. She had been stabbed at least 39 times, including 9 times in her throat, 5 times in her left lung, twice in her right lung, 5 times in her liver, twice in her spleen, 6 times in her stomach, once in the lower portion of her body, and once in her heart. Martha had died from what a physician determined was hemorrhage and loss of blood. He estimated her time of death as about 2:30 a.m., which corresponds with the, quote, sleeping, unquote, body noticed by the cab driver at 3:30 a.m. No blood was found on the stairs leading to the landing, indicating that Martha had been murdered on the landing, where she was found. However, not a single resident of George Yard Buildings had heard the faintest sound of trouble during the night. Even the superintendent of the buildings and his wife had both slept soundly between a door only 12 feet from the corpse. I doubt that they slept as well the next night. George Collier, the deputy coroner, called the killer a perfect savage and described the atrocity as, quote, almost beyond belief, one of the most dreadful murders anyone could imagine, unquote. A local newspaper proclaimed that Martha Tabram had been literally butchered. A few days later, about 70 local residents appointed a committee of 12 men to patrol the streets at night. If the murderer planned to strike again, he would have to be exceedingly careful and crafty. Nevertheless, Jack the Ripper's reign of unholy terror had only just begun. That fact would become apparent soon enough. Soon the newspapers would conclude that his savagery was not only, quote, beyond comprehension, unquote, but entirely unfit for publication. Jack the Ripper had learned well from his first experience and now believed that he could kill at will, and more efficiently, and far more horrifically. And he soon would. About 3 weeks later, the Ripper attacked his second victim, Mary Nichols. She was known to her friends as Polly and had just celebrated her 43rd birthday 5 days before. Now, Polly had been born in London and married at age 18 to William Nichols, a printer's machinist. Although they had 5 children, unfortunately their marriage ended after 16 years. William continued to raise their children and paid an allowance to Polly for the next year or two until he learned that she was living with another man, after which he seldom saw her. Thereafter she drank heavily, worked at various menial jobs, scraped to get by, and prostituted. In many unfortunate ways, her life was quite similar to that of Martha Tabram. On the 31st of August, 1888, at 1:20 a.m., an impoverished, destitute, and intoxicated Polly turned up at a common lodging house, but was turned away by the lodging house deputy because she did not have money for a bed for the night. Polly then asked the deputy to hold a bed for her while she got the money, laughing that she would get it soon, and shouting, quote, "See what a jolly bonnet I've got now," unquote, sporting a new hat of black straw trimmed in black velvet. At 2:30 a.m., Ellen Holland, a friend, spotted Polly 4 blocks from the 10 Bells, very intoxicated. Polly laughed, "I have had my lodging money 3 times today, and I have spent it. It won't be long before I'll be back." Then she left, tottering alone in the night along Whitechapel Road, and neither Ellen Holland nor any of Polly Nichols' other friends would ever see her alive again. About a 10-minute walk east of there, in the direction that Polly headed, was the Royal London Hospital. Now that was where Joseph, and he's often been misreported as John, but his name was Joseph Carey Merrick, known as the famous Elephant Man, would take up residence a couple of years later and spend the rest of his life. Just 1 block north of that hospital was Bucks Row, a narrow, gloomy street patrolled by Constable John Neal. As he walked its length at about 7:15 a.m., the policeman noticed nothing unusual. At about 3:40 a.m., Charles Cross, on his way to work, saw a body lying along the side of Bucks Row, along the gated entrance to a stable yard near the large board school building. He ran for help. 5 minutes later, patrolling Constable Neal discovered the body too. The woman was lying on her back, with her skirts raised, and with various stabbings about the trunk of her body. Her abdomen had been viciously ripped open from her breastbone to below her pelvis, leaving her intestines protruding. Beside her left hand was a new black straw bonnet trimmed with black velvet. According to the evidence, apparently Jack the Ripper had been standing in front of Polly Nichols when he suddenly seized her high about the throat with his left hand in a brutal strangling grasp, quickly bent her backwards toward the ground, and sliced her throat from ear to ear in 2 violent slashes. Silently, both carotid arteries had been severed, along with her esophagus, her windpipe, and all the flesh clear to her vertebrae. Polly had been no match for the Ripper, who had almost decapitated her. At about 4:05 a.m., Dr. Rhys Ralph Llewellyn arrived on the scene and pronounced Polly Nichols dead. Later he would state, quote, "I have seen many terrible cases, but never such a brutal affair as this," unquote. Most of her body was still warm. At that time, Dr. Llewellyn did not think that she could have been dead for more than half an hour. Since Polly could not have been killed before about 3:35 a.m., according to Dr. Llewellyn, and since Charles Cross had discovered her body at about 3:40 a.m., then about 5 minutes or less was all the time that Jack the Ripper had. But that was all the time that Jack the Ripper needed. Then he had vanished like a phantom into the night, and neither patrolling Constable Neal or a nearby watchman nor any of about a dozen residents of the dilapidated cottages alongside the gated stable yard had heard any sound or been aware of the slightest suspicious activity. Despite repeated examinations of the crime scene and careful questioning of all possible suspects, the police were as dumbfounded as they had been after the Ripper's first murder. A week later, Inspector Joseph Helson, in charge of the investigation, admitted, quote, "Not an atom of evidence can be obtained to connect any person with the crime," unquote. The police, however, would have a third chance, for only a few hours after Inspector Helson's admission, the maniac would attack again, more gruesomely than ever, in the daylight. Annie Chapman's life had not gone well. Then she met Jack the Ripper. She had married a coachman, John Chapman. They had 3 children, the last of whom was crippled. Then their 12-year-old daughter, Emily Ruth, died of meningitis, and their marriage was unable to survive the tragedy. Both parents slipped into alcoholism and then separated. John contributed to Annie's support for several years until he died of cirrhosis of the liver in 1886 on Christmas Day. At age 47, Annie's pain of having lost her daughter and then both her husband and source of support was crushing. With a broken heart and the inability to maintain herself properly, she grieved, sold flowers and crocheted articles, drank excessively, endured an infection of tuberculosis, and resorted to prostitution. Everyone knew the defeated woman as Dark Annie. On the 4th of September, a friend of Annie, Amelia Palmer, saw her looking poorly near the 10 Bells. She was not feeling well and had not had any food to eat that day. Amelia gave her a pittance and told her not to buy rum. 3 days later, Amelia saw Annie again near the 10 Bells. Annie told Amelia that she felt quite ill, but knew that she would have to pull herself together and get some money or she would have no bed for the night. A few hours later, on the 8th of September, 1888, at about 1:45 a.m., a nearly inebriated Annie told a lodging house deputy that although she did not have money for her bed, she knew how to get it. She insisted, "I shall be back soon. Don't let the bed," unquote. John Evans, the night watchman, then watched her as she wandered toward the 10 Bells, only a block to the east. It was then about 1:50 a.m. Just a block north of the 10 Bells, about 4 hours later, in the backyard at 29 Hanbury Street, all hell would break loose. The house at 29 Hanbury Street had been built for Spitalfields weavers, thousands of whom were Protestants, called Huguenots, who had been persecuted in France. They had sought refuge in England, particularly Spitalfields, from 1670 to 1710. Incidentally, the interior of the 10 Bells nearby was graced with a splendid ceramic mural, some 25 feet square, of a weaver displaying her fabrics a century before. It was titled "Spitalfields in Ye Olden Time, Visiting a Weaver's Shop." Later, the weaver's house at 29 Hanbury Street had been converted into dwellings for the poor. By 1888, the domicile had seen better days. Some parts of number 29 were commercial. Downstairs, Mrs. Hardiman ran a cat's meat shop. This was deteriorating horse meat, dyed blue or green to indicate that it was no longer fit for human consumption, and then sold as food for cats. Upstairs, Mrs. Richardson sold packing cases. Several other persons were employed there, but it was primarily residential. To 17 people, the jam-packed, dingy structure was actually home. Behind the house was a backyard about 12 feet by 15 feet, enclosed by a fence about 5.5 feet high. Aside from entering through the front door, passing through the resident's house, and then exiting through the back door, the only access to the backyard was through a side door. It was along the street and to the immediate right, of the front door and led through a narrow 25-foot passage along the right side of the house and into the backyard. At about 4:50 a.m., John Richardson, the son of the woman who sold packing cases, stopped by number 29 on his way to work at Old Spitalfields Market. He merely wanted to ensure that things were secure in his mother's backyard, as he customarily did. No one was in the backyard at the time, and he saw nothing unusual. Then he hurried on his way. Old Spitalfields Market, only a block away, was about to open for business at 5 a.m. Just before 5:30, a few minutes after sunrise, Mrs. Elizabeth Long walked along Hanbury Street. She was on her way to Old Spitalfields Market, too. As she drew near number 29, she saw Annie Chapman, who was facing her on the sidewalk, talking with a man whose back was toward her. About all that Mrs. Long noticed as she approached him from behind was that he was about 5 feet 7 inches tall, dark-complexioned, and had a respectable appearance. She thought that he was dressed in a dark-colored coat. In addition, he wore a brown deerstalker, similar to the hat with visors at the front and back worn by Sherlock Holmes. As Mrs. Long passed them, she heard the man ask, "Will you?" Annie replied, "Yes." Mrs. Long paid no attention and continued on the sidewalk toward Old Spitalfields Market. That man was almost certainly Jack the Ripper. It is most unfortunate that Mrs. Long did not glimpse the man's face. Nevertheless, she was fortunate indeed. In all probability, Elizabeth Long passed within inches of Jack the Ripper while he was prowling for another victim and lived to tell about it for the rest of her life. Albert Kadosh lived at number 27 Hanbury, next door to number 29. Only the wooden fence described earlier separated the backyards of the two dwellings. Apparently only a couple of minutes after Mrs. Long saw Annie and the man who wore the deerstalker talking on the street, Mr. Kadosh stepped into his backyard. Then he heard voices just a few feet away on the other side of the fence in the backyard of number 29. The only part of the conversation that was intelligible was the word "no." Mr. Kadosh then went back inside, but stepped out into his backyard again about 3 or 4 minutes later. Then he heard the sound of something falling against the fence. Then he went back inside and left for work. When he passed the 10 Bells, a block away, it was just after 5:30 a.m. John Davis, an elderly gentleman who lived at number 29, woke up at about 5:45 a.m. and had a cup of tea just to start the day off right. Then at about 6 o'clock he opened the main door to the backyard. The sight that he encountered shocked him almost to death. Just a few feet to his left, alongside the wooden fence, were strewn some of the gruesome remains of Annie Chapman. And by the way, imagine the creature that he would have encountered and the kind of day he would have had if he had opened his back door 15 minutes earlier, before he had his spot of tea. While Annie was lying on her back, with her left arm resting on her left breast, with her legs drawn up and her knees spread, her skirts had been thrown up to her abdomen. The Ripper had strangled her, had slashed her throat twice from ear to ear, and had then unsuccessfully tried twice to separate the bones of her neck with his knife in a failed attempt to decapitate her. Then he had disemboweled her, tossing part of her stomach on the ground above her left shoulder and dumping her intestines and a flap of her abdomen above her right shoulder. He had then cut out another part of her abdominal wall, her uterus, 2/3 of her bladder, and the upper part of her vagina, and had left, taking all those parts with him. At 6:10 a.m., Inspector Joseph Chandler arrived on the scene, followed at 6:30 a.m. by Dr. George Phillips, who had 23 years' experience as a police surgeon. Dr. Phillips saw no indications of a struggle and determined that the murder had occurred at that location. Later he would state, quote, I myself could not have performed all the injuries I saw on that woman and effect them even without a struggle in under a quarter of an hour." Unquote. None of the 17 residents of number 29 had seen or heard anything, even though 5 of them lived in rooms that overlooked the murder scene, and some of them had slept with their windows open, and the Ripper had butchered Annie in the daylight. He had not even paused at a spigot in the backyard to wash his gory hands. Imagine what he must have looked like emerging from the passageway through the side door and onto the sidewalk of Hanbury Street in the sunlight with all of Annie's bloody organs. Who would have dared to commit such a crime and attempt such an escape? That was one of the few questions that Scotland Yard could answer. Jack the Ripper. Again, it had seemed that he had nearly been caught, but not quite. Newspaper reporters were in a frenzy, and Londoners were in a panic. The police were under the most intense pressure to stop an incomprehensible maniac before he massacred again. Even so, Scotland Yard, despite following up hundreds of leads, searching numerous homes, and interrogating every conceivable suspect, was still without what they called, quote, "the slightest clue," unquote. It would be 3 weeks before Jack the Ripper would stalk the streets of Whitechapel again, but when he did, he would leave a trail of mayhem a mile long.